She was known as one of the toughest judges in America, a woman who had sentenced countless men to prison without a second thought. But when a black inmate stood before her with only hours left to live, he asked for something no one expected, and the way she responded shocked the entire courtroom. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's begin. Judge Margaret Harrison had built her reputation on unwavering discipline and absolute adherence to the law. For 23 years, she had presided over her courtroom with an iron fist, never allowing emotion to cloud her judgment. Her colleagues respected her, defense attorneys feared her, and prosecutors knew that in her court, justice would be served according to the letter of the law. She had earned the nickname the Steel Gavel among the legal community, a title she wore with quiet pride. But on this particular Tuesday morning in October, something was different. The autumn light filtered through the tall windows of the courthouse, casting long shadows across the mahogany benches where families usually sat in anxious silence. Today, however, the courtroom felt heavier, charged with an energy that made even the most seasoned court officers shift uncomfortably in their positions. Margaret arrived at her chambers earlier than usual, her morning routine disrupted by a restless night of sleep. She had reviewed the case file multiple times, but something about today's proceedings gnawed at her conscience in a way that 23 years of experience couldn't quite explain. The coffee in her hands had grown cold as she stared out her window, watching the city wake up below her. Her assistant knocked gently on the door. "Judge Harrison, they're ready for you in the courtroom." Margaret nodded, straightening her black robes and checking her reflection one final time in the mirror behind her desk. The woman staring back at her looked composed, professional, ready to handle whatever the day would bring. But behind her eyes, there was something she couldn't quite name, a flutter of uncertainty that she hadn't felt in years. The courtroom was unusually quiet as she entered. The bailiff called for all to rise, and the familiar ritual began. But as Margaret took her seat behind the bench, her eyes swept across the room and landed on the defendant's table. There, in orange prison attire, sat a man whose presence seemed to fill the space around him despite his quiet demeanor. His name was David Williams, and his file told a story that had become all too familiar in her courtroom. Born into poverty, raised in a neighborhood where survival often meant making impossible choices, he had found himself caught in a web of circumstances that led to this moment. But there was something about his posture, the way he held himself with dignity despite everything, that caught her attention. David's case had been moving through the system for months, and Margaret had overseen several hearings leading up to this day. She had watched him sit silently through testimony, never once interrupting or causing disruption. His public defender, a young woman named Sarah Chen, had fought tirelessly for him, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury had delivered their verdict, and now it fell to Margaret to carry out the final act of this legal drama. What made this case different wasn't just the severity of the crime or the weight of the sentence. It was the timing. Due to a series of legal complications and appeals that had stretched on for years, David's execution was scheduled for that very evening. The state had moved with unusual speed to carry out the sentence, leaving little time for the customary delays and final appeals that typically followed such decisions. Margaret had presided over capital cases before, but never with such compressed timing. Never with a defendant who would walk from her courtroom directly to his final hours. The responsibility felt heavier today, more personal somehow, though she couldn't understand why. As the proceedings began, she noticed something else unusual about David Williams. While most defendants in his position appeared either defiant or broken, he seemed almost peaceful. His eyes held a clarity that was unexpected, and when he looked at her, there was no anger, no resentment, just a quiet acceptance that unsettled her more than any outburst could have. The formalities moved forward with practiced efficiency. The clerk read the charges, the verdict was officially entered into the record, and Margaret began the familiar process of sentencing. But as she spoke the words that would seal David's fate, she found herself paying closer attention to his face, searching for something she couldn't identify. It was then that David's attorney requested permission for her client to address the court. This wasn't unusual. Defendants often made final statements before sentencing, but something in Sarah Chen's voice suggested this would be different. Margaret granted the request, expecting the typical plea for mercy or declaration of innocence. David rose slowly from his chair, his shackles clanking softly as he moved. The courtroom fell completely silent. Even the usual rustling of papers and shifting in seats ceased entirely. He looked directly at Margaret, and for a moment, the formal distance between judge and defendant seemed to dissolve. When he spoke, his voice was clear and steady, without the tremor of fear or desperation that she had come to expect. "Your Honor, I know that in a few hours, I will pay the ultimate price for my actions. I accept that. I'm not here to ask for mercy or to claim innocence. What I did was wrong, and I've spent every day since then living with that reality." Margaret leaned forward slightly, drawn in by the unexpected tone of his words. This wasn't the typical last-minute plea she had heard countless times before. There was something deeper here, something that made her forget about the clock ticking toward evening. "But I do have one request," David continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's not for me, Your Honor. It's for someone who deserves better than what I gave them. Someone who deserves to know that even in my final hours, I was thinking about making things right." The courtroom remained frozen in silence. Margaret felt her pulse quicken, though she maintained her composed exterior. In all her years on the bench, she had never encountered a moment quite like this one. The weight of what was about to unfold pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. David's next words would change everything, not just for him, but for Margaret herself. They would challenge every assumption she had made about justice, mercy, and the power of human connection in the face of ultimate consequences. The tough judge who had never wavered in her duty was about to face a test that would shake the very foundation of everything she believed about her role in the system. As David prepared to speak again, Margaret realized that this Tuesday morning would become a defining moment in her career, one that would haunt her long after the gavel fell for the final time. The steel resolve that had served her so well for over 2 decades was about to meet its greatest challenge, and she had no idea how profoundly this encounter would change her. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. David's hands, despite the shackles, moved with gentle precision as he reached into his shirt pocket. The bailiff tensed, but Margaret raised her hand slightly, a signal that had become instinctive after years of managing her courtroom. From his pocket, David pulled out a small, worn photograph. Even from her elevated position behind the bench, Margaret could see that it had been handled countless times, the edges soft and rounded from years of careful touching. His fingers trembled slightly as he held it up, and for the first time since entering her courtroom, his composure showed the faintest crack. "Your Honor, this is my daughter, Amelia. She's 7 years old now. Though this picture was taken on her 5th birthday, his voice caught for just a moment before steadying again. I haven't seen her since that day. Her mother, rightfully, decided that I couldn't be part of their lives after what I did. I understand that decision. I respect it. But there's something I need to do before tonight." Margaret found herself leaning forward despite every instinct telling her to maintain professional distance. The photograph seemed to pull her attention like a magnet, though she couldn't make out the details from where she sat. Around the courtroom, she noticed that everyone had shifted forward slightly, drawn into this unexpected moment of vulnerability. "My request, Your Honor, isn't for clemency or delay. It's not even for myself, really. What I'm asking for is the chance to record a message for my daughter, something she can have when she's older, when she's ready to understand who her father was beyond the worst thing he ever did." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. In 23 years of presiding over cases, she had heard every possible plea, every creative argument for leniency, every desperate attempt to avoid consequences. But this was something entirely different. David wasn't asking to escape his fate. He was asking for the opportunity to leave something meaningful behind, something that might help his daughter make sense of her father's story when the time came. Margaret's mind raced through the legal precedents, the protocols, the proper procedures for such an unusual request. There was no standard protocol for this situation. The execution schedule left no room for delays or complications. The state had made it clear that everything would proceed exactly as planned, with no deviations from the established timeline. But as she looked at David, still holding that precious photograph, Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. The steel resolve that had defined her career suddenly felt less like strength and more like a barrier she had built to protect herself from moments exactly like this one. "Mr. Williams," she began, her voice carrying the weight of years of judicial authority. "You understand that your execution is scheduled for 8 o'clock this evening. The state has made arrangements that cannot be altered without significant legal justification." David nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "I understand completely, Your Honor. I'm not asking for any delays or changes to the schedule. I know there are recording facilities at the prison. All I need is 20 minutes, maybe 30 at most, to record something that my daughter can have someday. Something that shows her I thought about her in my final hours, that I wanted her to know she was loved, even by someone who made terrible choices." The courtroom remained suspended in that heavy silence. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel the weight of every gaze in the room focused on her. The prosecutors sat rigid in their chairs, clearly uncomfortable with this deviation from standard procedure. The defense table radiated hope and desperation in equal measure. Margaret's thoughts drifted unbidden to her own father, who had passed away when she was barely older than David's daughter. She remembered the absence his death had created, the questions that would never be answered, the conversations they would never have. Her father had been a good man, a gentle soul who had taught her about justice and fairness before she ever set foot in a law school classroom. What would it have meant to her, she wondered, to have a final message from him, to hear his voice one last time, explaining his love for her, sharing his hopes for her future. The thought created an ache in her chest that she hadn't felt in years, but this situation was different. David Williams wasn't a dying father saying goodbye to his daughter. He was a convicted criminal whose actions had torn apart multiple families, including his own. The victims' families sat in the gallery, their own pain written across their faces as they watched this unexpected turn of events unfold. Margaret's eyes found them in the crowd, these people whose lives had been forever altered by David's choices. She saw grief that had aged them beyond their years, anger that still burned bright despite the passage of time, and something else, something that surprised her. In the eyes of the victim's mother, she saw not hatred, but a kind of exhausted resignation, as if the woman had carried her burden for so long that she no longer had the energy for rage. The complexity of the moment threatened to overwhelm Margaret's usual clarity of thought. Every legal instinct told her to deny the request, to maintain the boundaries that separated justice from mercy, punishment from compassion. But something deeper, something that connected to the part of her that had first been drawn to the law as a means of serving justice rather than simply dispensing punishment, whispered that there might be another way to approach this. She thought about David's daughter, growing up with a father's absence that could never be fully explained or understood. She thought about the ripple effects of trauma, how violence and loss echoed through generations, creating cycles that seemed impossible to break. Perhaps this small gesture, this final act of parental love from a man about to pay the ultimate price for his failures, might plant a seed of healing rather than perpetuating the cycle of pain. The clock on the courtroom wall ticked steadily toward noon. Time was becoming a factor in ways that Margaret had never experienced before. Every minute that passed brought David closer to his final appointment, but it also represented a closing window for this unprecedented request. Margaret realized that whatever decision she made in the next few moments would define not just David's final hours, but her own legacy as well. The tough judge who had never bent the rules was facing a test that would reveal who she really was beneath the black robes and stern reputation. The weight of the decision pressed against Margaret's chest like a stone. She had built her entire career on the foundation of unwavering consistency, never allowing personal feelings to interfere with the cold machinery of justice. Yet here she sat, faced with a request that challenged every principle she had held sacred for over 2 decades. She glanced at the prosecution table, where District Attorney Robert Chen sat with his arms crossed, his expression making it clear that any deviation from protocol would be met with fierce resistance. The state had invested considerable resources in ensuring this execution proceeded without complications, and Margaret knew that her decision would be scrutinized at the highest levels of government. But then her eyes returned to David, still standing with that photograph clutched in his hands. The image of his daughter seemed to radiate an innocence that stood in stark contrast to the gravity of the situation surrounding them. Margaret found herself wondering what kind of man David had been before the choices that led him to this courtroom. Had he been the kind of father who read bedtime stories, who kissed scraped knees, who dreamed of watching his little girl graduate from college? The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Margaret could hear the scratch of a court reporter's pen, the subtle creak of wooden benches as people shifted in their seats, the distant hum of air conditioning that seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed atmosphere. Finally, she spoke, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Mr. Williams, your request is highly unusual. In my 23 years on this bench, I have never encountered a situation quite like this one." David's shoulders tensed slightly, but his gaze remained steady. "I understand, Your Honor. I know it's not something that happens every day. But my daughter, she's going to grow up with questions. Questions about who I was, what I believed in, whether I ever thought about her. I can't change what I did. I can't undo the pain I caused. But maybe, just maybe, I can leave her with something that shows her she was loved." Margaret's throat tightened unexpectedly. The rawness in his voice, the complete absence of self-pity, struck something deep within her that she had carefully buried beneath years of judicial detachment. This wasn't manipulation or a last-ditch effort to gain sympathy. This was a father's desperate attempt to reach across the void of his own making to touch his child one final time. She turned her attention to the victim's family, knowing that their feelings had to be considered in any decision she made. The mother of the young man David had killed sat in the front row, her face a map of grief that time had failed to heal. Margaret had seen her at every hearing, every proceeding, a constant reminder of the human cost of the crime that had brought them all to this moment. To Margaret's surprise, the woman rose slowly from her seat. The courtroom held its collective breath as she stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper when she finally spoke. "Your Honor, may I say something?" Margaret nodded, though every fiber of her judicial training screamed that this was spiraling far beyond normal courtroom procedure. "You may address the court, Mrs. Patterson." The woman's hands shook as she gripped the rail separating the gallery from the court proper. "My son Michael was 22 years old when he died. He had just graduated from college, was planning to propose to his girlfriend, had his whole life ahead of him." Her voice cracked, but she continued with a strength that commanded respect from everyone in the room. "I've sat through every hearing, every appeal, every delay in this case. I've watched Mr. Williams, and I've seen something that I didn't expect to see. I've seen remorse, real remorse. Not the kind that comes from getting caught, but the kind that comes from truly understanding what you've taken away." Margaret leaned forward, completely absorbed in Mrs. Patterson's words. The woman's next statement would later be described by court observers as one of the most powerful moments in the courthouse's long history. "My son was a father too. He had a 3-year-old daughter who will never really know her daddy. She asks about him sometimes, and I tell her stories, show her pictures, play videos we recorded when she was a baby. Those memories, those pieces of him that we can share with her, they're precious beyond measure. Mrs. Patterson's eyes found David across the courtroom, and something passed between them that Margaret couldn't quite identify. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was something deeper than the raw hatred she had expected to see. If Mr. Williams wants to leave something for his daughter, something that might help her understand that despite his terrible choices, he loved her, then I won't stand in the way of that. My granddaughter deserves to know her father's love, even though he's gone. Maybe his daughter deserves the same thing, even under these circumstances. The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations as Mrs. Patterson returned to her seat. Margaret felt the ground shift beneath everything she thought she understood about justice, mercy, and the complex web of human relationships that her courtroom decisions affected. District Attorney Chen rose immediately, his voice sharp with objection. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The execution schedule has been set by the state, approved at the highest levels of government. We cannot allow emotional appeals to derail the legal process that has brought us to this point. Margaret held up her hand, silencing the prosecutor. She understood his position, respected it even, but something fundamental had changed in the last few minutes. The rigid framework of legal procedure suddenly felt less like protection and more like a cage, preventing her from accessing the deeper purposes that the law was meant to serve. Mr. Chen, I appreciate your concerns, and I understand the state's position. However, I am not convinced that allowing Mr. Williams to record a brief message for his daughter would constitute any meaningful delay in the execution schedule. She turned to address David directly. Mr. Williams, if I were to grant your request, you understand that it would need to happen within very strict parameters. The recording would take place at the correctional facility under full supervision and would not delay your scheduled execution by even a single minute. David's eyes filled with tears for the first time since entering the courtroom. Yes, Your Honor, I understand completely. All I need is the chance to tell her that I love her, that I'm sorry for the pain my choices have caused, and that I hope she'll grow up to be everything I failed to be. Margaret felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. She knew that her next words would be analyzed, criticized, and debated for years to come. Legal scholars would question her judgment. Prosecutors would cite this case as an example of judicial overreach, and defense attorneys would point to it as a precedent for compassionate sentencing. But in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was a 7-year-old girl who would grow up without a father, and the opportunity to give her something that might help her make sense of a senseless situation. Margaret's voice, when she finally spoke, carried the authority of her office, but also something else, something that hadn't been heard in her courtroom for many years. It carried the weight of human understanding, of recognition that sometimes justice required more than simple punishment. Mr. Williams, I am going to grant your request, with the understanding that this is an extraordinary circumstance that should not be viewed as precedent for future cases. The courtroom exploded in reaction. Reporters scrambled to capture every word. Family members on both sides of the tragedy processed the unexpected decision, and court officers exchanged glances of surprise and uncertainty. Margaret raised her gavel, bringing order back to the proceedings. The recording will take place this afternoon at the correctional facility, under the supervision of prison officials and representatives of this court. The execution will proceed as scheduled. Mr. Williams will have exactly 30 minutes to record his message. As she spoke these words, Margaret realized that she was crossing a line from which there would be no return. The tough judge who had never shown mercy was about to discover what it meant to balance justice with compassion and life in ways she couldn't. The consequences of that discovery gave out beneath would ripple through Heard's legs, nearly yet imagine. Daviank in, his him as the reality of her decision, steady him, tears attorney reached out to streaming down her own face as she witnessed this unprecedented moment of judicial mercy. But Margaret wasn't finished. Her final words before calling for recess would echo through the legal community for years to come, challenging assumptions about the role of judges in society and the true meaning of justice in a complex world. Court will recess until 4 o'clock this afternoon, at which time we will reconvene to address any final matters before Mr. Williams' transfer to the correctional facility. The gavel fell with a sound that seemed to reverberate through the very foundations of the courthouse, marking not just the end of a hearing, but the beginning of a transformation that would change everyone involved in ways they were only beginning to understand. As the courtroom emptied, Margaret remained seated behind her bench, the weight of her decision settling over her like a heavy cloak. The familiar sounds of shuffling papers and closing briefcases felt distant, almost dreamlike. She had just made a choice that would define the remainder of her career and possibly her life. The afternoon hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Margaret found herself unable to focus on the stack of cases waiting on her desk. Instead, she kept returning to the image of David Williams holding that photograph of his daughter. The look in his eyes hadn't been desperation or manipulation. It had been pure, unfiltered love, the kind that transcends even the darkest circumstances. Her phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters, legal colleagues, and state officials who had heard about the morning's unprecedented events. Margaret ignored them all, knowing that once she started explaining her decision, she would be forced to defend it in ways that might diminish its power. At 3:30, her assistant knocked on the door. "Judge Harrison? The warden from the correctional facility is here to discuss the arrangements." Margaret straightened her shoulders, preparing to face the practical realities of her compassionate decision. Warden Thompson was a stern man in his 50s, someone who had spent decades managing the state's most dangerous criminals. His expression was carefully neutral as he entered her chambers. "Your Honor, I want you to know that we've made the necessary arrangements for Mr. Williams's recording session. We've set up a quiet room with professional equipment, and we'll have 2 officers present at all times for security purposes." Margaret nodded, grateful for his cooperation, despite what she knew must be his reservations about the unusual request. "Thank you, Warden. I know this isn't standard protocol." "No, it isn't," he replied, his tone remaining professional. "But I've been in this job for 22 years, and I've learned that sometimes the most important things we do are the ones that don't appear in any manual or guidebook." His words surprised Margaret. She had expected resistance, perhaps even hostility, from the corrections system. Instead, she found an ally who understood the deeper implications of what was happening. "There is one thing I need to mention," Warden Thompson continued. "The victim's mother, Mrs. Patterson, has requested permission to be present during the recording. She wants to hear what Mr. Williams has to say." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. This was another layer of complexity she hadn't anticipated. "What does Mr. Williams think about that?" "He said he would be honored to have her there, if that's what she wants. He believes she has every right to hear anything he has to say." The depth of David's humility continued to surprise Margaret. Even facing his final hours, he was thinking about others, considering their needs and their pain, alongside his own desperate desire to reach his daughter. At 4 o'clock sharp, the courtroom reconvened. The afternoon light slanted through the windows at a different angle now, casting new shadows across the familiar space. David Williams was brought back in, his orange jumpsuit a stark reminder of the reality that awaited him in just a few hours. Margaret noticed immediately that something had changed in his demeanor. The peace she had observed that morning had deepened into something almost transcendent. He moved with the careful grace of someone who had made peace with his fate and found purpose in his final act. "Mr. Williams," Margaret began, her voice carrying across the unusually quiet courtroom, "the arrangements have been made for your recording session. You will have 30 minutes at the correctional facility, under proper supervision, to record your message for your daughter." David stood slowly, his shackles creating a soft, metallic whisper in the silence. "Thank you, Your Honor." You have given me a gift that I will carry with me into eternity. The chance to tell my daughter that she was my greatest joy, even though I failed her in every way that mattered. Margaret felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but she maintained her composure. Mr. Williams, is there anything else you need to say to this court before we conclude these proceedings? David looked around the courtroom, his gaze touching each person present. When his eyes found Mrs. Patterson, he spoke directly to her. Mrs. Patterson, I know that no from you and words can undo what I took your family. Your son's life was precious, and I destroyed something beautiful that can never be replaced. I am grateful that my daughter will grow up in a world that knew your son's goodness, even though it was cut short by my actions. Mrs. Patterson wiped tears from her cheeks, but nodded slightly, acknowledging his words without offering forgiveness, but without rejecting them either. Margaret realized that she was witnessing something extraordinary, a moment where justice and mercy intersected in ways that legal textbooks could never adequately explain. The formal boundaries of her courtroom had dissolved, replaced by something more fundamental, more human. Mr. Williams, this court hereby orders that you be transported to the State Correctional Facility, where you will have the opportunity to record your final message before the sentence of this court is carried out at 8 o'clock this evening. As the bailiffs prepared to escort David from the courtroom, he turned back to Margaret one final time. Your Honor, you have shown me a kindness that I didn't deserve and will never forget. Thank you for helping me be a father one last time. The words hit Margaret with unexpected force. In all her years of sentencing, she had never thought about the parental bonds that were severed by her decisions. She had focused on punishment, deterrence, and the abstract concept of justice, but she had rarely considered the children left behind, the relationships that ended in her courtroom. That evening, as David Williams spoke his final words of love into that recording device, Judge Margaret Harrison sat in her chambers, forever changed. The tough judge who had never bent the rules had discovered that sometimes true justice requires more than punishment. It requires recognizing the humanity in everyone who stands before us. David's message reached his daughter years later, a testament to a father's love that transcended his failures.